Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Okay, one last roundup of the year. We're focusing mainly on the last quarter of 2023 and stuff that came out from October to November and a little in December. Technically a shorter span of time than the other roundups I've done this year, but this time of year is always the busiest when it comes to new releases. As such, I've got another typically meaty collection of 26 releases on the docket. Less round number than usual, but whatever. As always, don't feel like you need to watch all of it in one sitting if you don't want to, but I always try to make it as breezy a watch as possible for anyone who does. And as always, if you're interested in my favorite and least favorite tracks on any given release, you can find a pastebin document linked in the description. Anyway, let's not waste any more time and just get into it. Starting off with, from Actress, 88.
Push power.
Actress is the alias for experimental artist Darren J. Cunningham. He got his start in the late 2000s and has been a regular on the Ninja Tune label for about a decade now. I've known about this guy for a while, but never got around to actually checking his stuff out. After submerging from a number of commenters, seeing some big ups from reviewing colleagues, and of course seeing that he had a new album, I felt like this was the perfect time for me to catch myself up on his work. So, here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. Alright, I can pretty easily see why people are drawn to this guy's work right off the bat. The combination of instrumental hip-hop, house, experimental, and ambient influences that all come together in such a low-key, muted, but subtly off-kilter mix isn't quite comparable to anything else out there. I fuck with it. Pretty much just the last album again, but longer. It's okay. Like the last album, but better. A little livelier, more striking, more diverse. Improvements across the board. I think this one ended up being my favorite of his projects. More stuff in the same vein as before, but even dustier and more experimental and hazy and intriguingly colorless than ever before. Also, there's a few, like, vaporwave-y touches to this one. I didn't like it as much as the last one, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Definitely benefits from giving your full attention. This is the one I've heard about the most. It's got a much cleaner techno-focused sound than the previous ones. A lot more about the synths than the samples. Some tracks definitely grab me a lot more than others, but there's enough of those high points to carry the album anyway. There's an Angel in My Shower is excellent. This is a project he did in collaboration with the London Contemporary Orchestra. Not a crossover I would have expected, but it's definitely an interesting expansion on his sound that goes over pretty well, and the couple of tracks retooled from earlier in his catalog have a whole different feel to them to set them apart from the originals, in the same vein as, like, Alarm Will Sound's covers of Aphex Twin and Oudiker. And this one brings in a bunch of modern R&B elements with full-on guest vocals from artists like Sampha, among others. Also with a few of the orchestral and acoustic elements from the last project carried over. Despite these new elements, it's not really that much different from what you'd already expect out of him. Generally cool, I don't know if it's among his absolute best work. Which brings us to here. So, yeah, I think I pretty immediately got the appeal of Actress. He is not a particularly showy artist, and his mixes are always really moody and downbeat. I can kinda understand why I've seen a number of people write him off as boring and overhyped by the music press. But he still nailed down a sound of his own that, while having a very similar appeal to artists like Boards of Canada, Burial, Andy Stott, and any number of others, doesn't actually sound like any of those. Oneohtrix Point Never's Replica might be the closest I can think of, but that doesn't hit on it either. As unassuming as all this music may feel, I consistently got the feeling that there was always more going on if you were willing to look beyond the surface. A lot of clever ideas which were very subtle but intriguingly out of the box. Anyway, as for this latest album, which has a bit of a loose concept based around chess and game theory, nothing's really changed beyond what you'd already expect what he's done on albums like AZD or RIP or any number of others, but he is delivering yet another solid collection of work in that usual style. I do feel like the opener, Push Power, probably stands as my favorite cut here. The way all the different vocal snippets bounce off the electro beats and pianos really furthers that off-kilter and subtly intriguing feeling I've come to enjoy in his work. And when those strings come in and the beat work adds and hi-hats, they really feel like big, meaningful moments. I also like how the second track hit that spiff, kind of recontextualize the same ideas from that track into a more ambient context, and its plinky melodies hit a similar note to his earlier track, Falling Rizlas. Other highlights include the stripped-back and atmospheric blend of IDM and R&B influences on Game Over, the layers of off-kilter sample loops on Typewriter World. I can see how an artist like Vale Smith might specifically take influence from that kind of thing. I see also the chopped-up soul samples on It's Me, the incredibly minimalistic but wholly immersive ambience on Green Blue Amnesia Magic Haze, the piano-driven garage beats on Owe, and the particularly emotional and deep, mostly solo piano cut M2. Not to say there aren't some tracks that didn't leave as strong an impact. The acid-tinged deep house grooves on AZD Rain and Closer Pluto are cool, but not the most memorable. The latter feels like an odd choice for a closer, though I guess it echoes how AZD ended with a more up-tempo cut in Visa. The hazy experimental grooves of Memory Haze and Asaphysics are definitely the kind of thing that only Actress would deliver, though there's not really much going on within them, and I tended not to be as drawn to them as a result. And that one interlude, Chill, doesn't really add anything of substance. But still, it's hard to complain much about moments like these either. I enjoy all of them while they're on. Overall, I mean, I'm not gonna say this album is anything absolutely mind-blowing, and if you've been following Actress for long enough, you're probably not gonna hear any, like, broad new steps or twists on his usual sound that you haven't heard him do before. But he's doing all those sounds exactly as effectively as they appeared on those previous albums, and still pretty easily held my attention the whole way through. It's the kind of project that could act as an easy starting point to get into his work if you so chose. It pretty easily demonstrates his appeal as an artist and what he can bring to the table that really only he does. And it'll certainly communicate that more immediately than something like, say, Ghettoville, which might be a headier and more difficult listen. So, yeah, I'm more than happy to give this my recommendation anyway. Very solid stuff. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Romy, Mid-Air. Alright, Romy, best known as one of the lead vocalists from the band The XX. I'll be honest and say I nearly skipped over checking this one out, even if I may think Romy is an absolutely incredible singer with the power to carry so much forlorn emotional gravitas and maturity in her voice, and I've loved her appearances on tracks like Jamie XX's Seesaw and Loud Places. I've never had that strong a connection to her work with the XX back when they were at their most popular. The less electronic stripped-back indie pop style of the full band efforts didn't appeal to me as much as Jamie's solo work. And when I looked up this album and saw the vast majority of it was produced or co-produced by Fred again, a producer who's never really interested me and I've never fully bought into the hype of, that wasn't exactly confidence-inspiring. Not to mention, as the rest of this roundup will make abundantly clear, I feel like we haven't exactly been starved for quality house music lately. But this had been getting quite a bit of positive buzz, and I figured, what the hell, let's just give it a try. And it's a good thing I did, because damn, this was really good. The project is really short and doesn't exactly leave a lot in the way of discussion beyond its rock-solid house grooves and Romy's impassioned performances telling a somewhat anonymous lesbian love story as a loose concept. And this didn't necessarily change my mind on Fred again's viability as a solo artist. But after hearing this, I at the very least can now see how his style would work better when he's actively taking a backseat to someone else. And especially someone with as solid instincts for moody pop to match his style as Romy can deliver. Directly cited inspirations include Calvin Harris and Dua Lipa's One Kiss, Tiesto's remix of Delirium Silence, not the last time that one's gonna come up in this roundup, and the band Everything But the Girl, and this project definitely captures the appeal of all of those. I do feel like the project's singles are pretty easily its strongest moments. Love Her is a great opener and tone setter, The Sea and Strong have particularly hard-hitting grooves, and the latter pretty instantly became my favorite track that directly has Fred again's name attached to it. And Enjoy Your Life, the one track with Jamie XX's co-production, big surprise, probably my favorite track here overall. Easily has the most energetic groove out of any track here, and hits in the same way as my favorite Dua Lipa tracks. But there's good deep cuts too, especially in the second half. I like how a bunch of them like segue into each other. Also, the title track is a nice ambient interlude with help from Brian Eno, and the album closes as strong as it starts with She's on My Mind. The only dud for me was One Last Try. That one has all this languid vocal processing on it that reminds me of what I don't like on Fred Again productions, despite ironically not featuring his contributions at all. But yeah, all around, really solid house effort here. Gave me a bit of nostalgia for the days when I would, like, you know, actively look forward to hearing big Billboard charting pop artists making dance hits enough to make countdown videos on it. If you were thinking of skipping it like I initially was, that might be worth remedying. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Forest Swords, Bolted. Damn, Forest Swords. Now there's a name I haven't thought about in a long time. I actually covered this guy once before, way back when his 2017 album Compassion came out. I remember thinking that project was solid, if a bit too similar to what his label mate Bonobo was doing at the time to stick with me, despite all the darker and edgier twists on that sound, and the track Raw Language still absolutely slapping. At the very least, hearing a new project from him all these years later has me glad that between him and Actress still kicking, that not everything Ninja Tune puts out these days is just commercial radio-friendly house, and they still have some artists who are very much able to retain their experimental edges. This project certainly shows Forest Sword sticking to the elements of his style that actually made him more unique and set him apart from the crowd, really doubling down on the frightening blends of blown-out distortion, heavy beats, and foreboding psychedelic drones that colored his earlier work, and still retaining the more organic instrumental textures that made his initial signing to Ninja Tune back when he did feel as fitting as it was. All these tracks go suitably hard and feel raw and experimental, maybe even more industrial-leaning than his previous work, while still being surprisingly palatable for what it is. With that said, I did find the experience to run together quite a lot, and I don't feel it gives me much to break down. There are still definite highlights, be it more rhythmic bangers like Rubble, Hyope, or End that all have their own different, mildly catchy mixes of distorted percussion and atmospheric sample chops, and the latter has maybe like a tiny bit of dance and rock flavor to it. There are a couple tracks like Night Sculpture or Caged which lean away from the more blown-out heaviness and go for something much more ambient and melody-centric. The track Butterfly Effect has a nice vocal appearance from Nina Cherry, and the album is a solidly fitting enough opener and closer with the industrial munitions and the languid but mildly foot-tapping Line Gone Cold, which apparently features a voice memo from the late Lee Scratch Perry. But that's about the full extent of things I have to say about this project. Chances are if you've enjoyed Forest Sword's work in the past, you'll enjoy this project as well, and I certainly enjoyed myself while it was on and didn't find it to be anything objectionable. I just have a feeling I'm not going to remember any of it longer term, so yeah, I'm overall feeling like a strong 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Pendulum, Anima EP. Oh yeah, Pendulum are still at it. Good to see them continuing to release things. With that said, this latest EP isn't anything earth-shattering. You can copy-paste a lot of my thoughts on their Elemental EP from 2021 onto this. Most of the EP kind of feels like a retread of stuff they've already done. Halo with Bullet for My Valentine feels like a retread of what they did with In Flames on Self vs. Self. Not really a track I was much of a fan to begin with, so not really the kind of thing that got me excited. Color Fast feels like a retread of a bunch of other old tracks that also have color in their title, like Watercolor and Hold Your Color. Though to be fair, it does absolutely have a solid enough tune at its core to get away with it. Mercy Killing is a track that leaves me extremely conflicted. The guitar riffs and beatwork at the track's loudest moments go really damn hard, but the guest appearances from Scarlord are really out of place as the track seems to briefly go off on an unrelated detour to switch over to generic trap beats with edgy rap verses, and anytime those came up I was like, oh man, did you completely ruin the moment. Though the EP's ending with Silent Spinner is a nice breath of fresh air and an interesting idea that doesn't sound like any other previous Pendulum track. Got this much more stripped back, 6 on the floor beat, bit of a black skinhead sort of groove. And Rob Swire's delivery going up next to the occasional bursts of distortion certainly adds up to some suitably menacing effect. I wouldn't say I was excited by this as I was by Come Alive on the last EP, but it's pretty neat anyway. Overall, I mean, it's definitely more Pendulum just doing their usual thing, and I can't complain too much about that, though I kinda doubt you're going to hear anything here that'll change your life or that will come near the band's actual best work in their initial run in the 2000s and early 2010s, so take that all as you will. I'm overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Martinou, Chiral. Next up is a random Bandcamp daily rec. This is a Swedish melodic techno and house producer, delivering his especially breezy and uplifting sophomore album. I haven't heard his debut. But yeah, if you're looking for something that touches into strains of deep house, dub techno, and even some trance influences, this is definitely going to be worth hearing. I do maybe feel like the album might get off to a bit of a weak start with a track like Reverie hitting maybe a bit too subtle in one note of a groove, but once we hit the much more dub techno influenced grooves of Demise, things really start to pick up and there's not a single miss from that point on. Be it harder hitting grooves on cuts like the house tinge Locked In with its solid bass lines and the spacey dub techno of Surface Tension, tracks which get a lot more open and melodic and atmospheric on tracks like Take Me There, Devotion, and An Inclination, and finally finishing in particularly satisfying ambient territory with Exit to Bliss. Also, if you buy the album on Bandcamp, there's a secret track called Guardian, which makes for an even stronger closer with some of the most comforting and tender sounding melodies you'll hear on any tracks in this vein in 2023, this side of that Leaving Laurel album, or maybe Tourists Inside Out from last year. I don't know if there's much else I can really break down in this album beyond that. It is still a techno record at its core with tracks that don't exactly, you know, like progress much over time. It's more of an album about like sinking yourself into its one singular vibe, and I'm not entirely sure how much long-term staying power this will end up having. But I put this project on twice while going on a long walk, and it felt like this album was just consistently keeping my spirits up and giving me more energy to keep walking further and further. It's just such a nice, enveloping mood brightener and lives up to the sky blue mood of the album cover. So, you know, even if the feelings of joy it delivered for me turn out to be more fleeting in the long run, I feel like I got enough out of this in the moment for this to just barely get away with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from G. Jones, Paths. G. Jones is an experimental bass producer based in Portland, Oregon that I've technically known about for a long time and yet never properly looked into previously. I saw his name for the first time when he and Bleep Bloop had joint guest features on the DJ Shadow track Pitter Patter from his Mountain Will Fall album in 2016. And while I definitely enjoyed that track, his name never really registered to me at any other point. I have a feeling if I'd been paying attention when he put out projects like his Visions EP or his debut album The Ineffable Truth back in 2018, then I likely would have had a bit of a knee-jerk negative impression of his music, just because he sits within that wonky style of bass music combined with mild trap influences that tends not to really be my cup of tea, and a lot more so back when those projects were new. But I don't know. In any case, I hadn't really been paying attention when those projects came out. What actually got him on my radar was an EP he put out right at the end of last year called Illusory Tracks that I saw a bunch of people really buzzing about, including Fantano. I didn't check it out myself until like maybe 2 months ago or something, but that project turned out to be a really neat exploration and experimental twist on old school 90s rave styles, not unlike what his frequent collaborator Eprom ended up doing earlier this year with his Syntheism album. I can see why it turned as many heads as it did, and that at least had me curious to see what he might be delivering with this full sophomore album here. And as it turns out, this project delivers pretty much everything I liked in that EP, to spottier results and less tight pacing. Certainly the sound design on this thing is really consistently on point, really bright and colorful with lots of crazy experimental twists and turns, and nearly every moment on this thing will give you something cool to pay attention to and make all of it sound really well balanced. Though I did find myself getting into specific tracks on this thing a lot more than others. Cuts like Too Far Gone making a melody out of those TR-808 plucks with acid bass, Which Way with its weird sparse MIDI steel drums and bubble sounds building up to crazy heavy bass in its drops, Liminality with its classic 90s breakbeats going up next to all these weird forward-reversed video game synth noises, or Maybe, which starts off sounding like it's going to be some kind of low-key ambient moment but ends up paying off in easily the most satisfying drop of any track here. All of these go super hard. And in the second half there's a bunch of tracks that have a bit more of an emotional focus to them, especially In My Room, which brings in all these really nice pianos going up next to some MIDI flutes that occasionally give the track a little bit of like a Blank Banshee vibe. And later Remnant, which feels like it's taking some very similar melodic lines but repurposing them into this super colorful future bass cut a la Rusty's Glass Swords. But it seems like there were just as many cuts here which didn't really seem to go anywhere interesting. Be it the mostly forgettable intro, Familiar Frontiers, or tracks like Glowing Experiences, Dancing on the Edge, or even the closer Long Walk Home, which ended up blending a bit too much into their surrounding tracks without doing enough to really set themselves apart in my mind. I do appreciate the presence of an entirely ambient cut in Perpetual Bloom, and do find all its cascading electric pianos to be very pretty, but this track didn't end up resonating as much as the other much more high-energy cuts surrounding it. This is an album that left me very torn. Like, the low points often just bounced off me in a similar way that stuff from other artists like Tipper can. in that, as impressive as the sound design is, the actual songcraft at the core can feel like it's taking a backseat to the sound design, leading to stuff that's very cool if you give it your full attention, but very easy to fall in the background. But that's clearly not the case for more than half the track listing. There's a bunch of tracks here which do work really well as standalone songs and stick out in that way, and the entire album definitely has more of an easier accessibility than someone like Tipper, playing a little more to an EDM adjacent audience than he would. So, I don't know, I'm left with very all-over-the-place feelings on this one. I don't think it's going to be a keeper, but at the end of the day, I'll still take all the great moments on this thing and say they made it worth hearing anyway. I don't think it's a great album as a whole, but it is definitely a good one. Like, a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from 1 Million Eyes, Iris. 1 Million Eyes is the duo of Italian producers Luciano Ermondi and Paolo Mazzacani, previously known as Tempelhof, but out of a want to start fresh, they changed the name they operate under in 2021 when they put out an album called Brahma for the label A Strangely Isolated Place. Now, I'll admit that while I may have heard of Tempelhof in passing, I haven't actually heard any of their work aside from this. I just got alerted to the sophomore album from the duo's new project thanks to being on the mailing list for A Strangely Isolated Place, and I just thought the album cover looked cool, so I threw it in here. Also, the projects I've heard out of this label have a particularly good track record as far as, like, really expansive and spacious ambient music goes. And yeah, this pretty much turned out to be exactly what I expected. A small collection of 10 particularly spacious and uplifting ambient vignettes, most of which sort of feel like if you took classic atmospheric trance or drum and bass tracks and removed all the drums. Continually building up, but, you know, like never paying off to a drop, or really exploding in the way they would if this wasn't trying to be an ambient record first and foremost. The 10 tracks here don't really flow into each other or go out of their way to add up to an overarching whole, but I do like how each one of them has a unique spin on the same sort of sound and atmosphere. There's tracks which build themselves around vocal samples, like those on Ketel Soul and Cante Jondo, which give off this ethereal dream pop vibe that reminds me of the band Bent. Tracks which build themselves out of subtle trance synths, so like opener Tangeri or Maori, where they feel like a step away from being effective atmospheric bangers if beats were added in. Or Look Up, which takes similar synth blends and repurposes them in a more subtle way that reminds me of some old carbon-based Lifeforms cuts. There's cuts which introduce guitars in a cool way, like Deserto and possibly Cambiasso. That one just has some more post-rock adjacent vibes than anything. And there's tracks like Sarah Kaneko and closer Sign Fine, which go for a more stripped-back ambient sound than anything else here, and sound like a way more positive and happy spin on synth textures you might hear out of Boards of Canada. The album as a whole definitely has a tendency to fall in the background for me. I wouldn't say it sticks out so much within the grander scheme of this genre to become a longer-term keeper, but there's not really much I can complain about in terms of its execution and the ideas they were going for. Every track felt like it could be a standout in context, and there's no filler. Overall, it's a nice low-key time. If you're in the mood for some deeper and well-fleshed-out ambient textures, it's worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from John Tejada, Resound. Alright, got a new album from techno producer John Tejada. Earlier this year he put out a pretty interesting side project in collaboration with Marc Adstrom under the name Optometry. The album was called Afterimage. You saw a little bit of a pivot towards a blend somewhere between synth pop, trip hop, his usual techno sound, and even a tiny hint of alt rock. I thought it turned out to be pretty solid, worth going back to if you missed it. I covered it in the Volume 11 roundup. For this latest album, it seems he's taken some of the new directions that Optometry album was moving in, but repurposing them into a more standard dance music context, delivering a tech house project that also combines its straightforward grooves with some brighter synth pop melodies and some fuzzy and dreamlike guitar soundscapes for extra flavor, even bringing in Marc Adstrom for some guest vocals on one track, even if she is kind of buried in the mix. I am a little conflicted on this project, because in one breath, all 7 tracks on this thing sound almost exactly the same. There's very little in the way of variety aside from, like, maybe a couple of lead melodies being slightly more sour, like on Centered or Different Mirrors, the track Trace Remnant leaning more into the dreamier side of the guitars, and the above-mentioned track with a Marc Adstrom feature. and even those sound pretty similar. But on the other hand, the one particular groove that pretty much all these tracks stick to the whole time is really damn addicting. It just hits me very immediately from when the opener Simulacrum starts, just keeps me invested and never gets old. And it dips out after just 7 tracks in 35 minutes, just the right length for the sound to never wear out its welcome, but letting the album still feel like an actual album and not like an EP on the side or something. I've definitely heard John Tejada albums that gave me more to latch onto than this, but I've also heard albums from him that gave me less to latch onto. I would be lying if I'd said I didn't find the listening experience of this to be pretty exciting for what it's going for. It may only have one flavor, but it is a really good flavor and ends up working well as like a turn your brain off and vibe kind of listen. So take that all as you will. If you've enjoyed his stuff in the past, it'll be just as worth a shot as anything else he's put out. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Offland, Unknown Frequencies. Alright, next random Bandcamp find. This is a project that released on Lee Norris's Fantasy Enhancing label, coming from an artist who's been operating within the genre regularly since the late 2000s, but I haven't heard any other projects from. Since it came out on Bandcamp Friday and the album cover looked cool, I decided to buy it on impulse. And it turned out to be really solid. Very straightforward but solidly meditative ambient techno that has a particularly laid-back and serenely organic touch. The project may have its tracks that focus on the more ambient techno side and give off those classic Pete Namlook type vibes on cuts like the opener Bloop, or SHGBO2+14A, or Cassini. All have a lot of really nice enveloping cinematic atmosphere, and the latter has among my favorite melodies in the bunch. But other cuts really focus on an even more serene and peaceful major key vibe with cuts like Skyquakes or Past or the epic 9-minute closer Whale. And as the project goes on, I start to notice more tracks which start to involve a little more organic textures, especially in the percussion, as seen on tracks like Colossi of Memnon, EVP, the minimal ambient keyboards on Upsweep, or the particularly dub-influenced Poacher. And I think my favorite track here is the almost 9-minute Spheric, which kind of evolves through a bunch of different phases that explore lots of different sides other tracks on this album were focusing on, but like all together at once. Not to say the project doesn't have its occasional weaker spots, which might stand to reason given it runs on for nearly 80 minutes. There's tracks like Quacker or Number Station, which didn't really deliver an interesting enough idea to pull me in as much as other cuts here. But at the end of the day, it does feel like yet another kind of project where the focus is more on sinking yourself in the overarching vibe that every track is contributing to. And even if it might run on a tad long, I don't mind too much since I more often than not just find myself getting swept up in all of it. So, yeah, if all this sounds like the kind of thing you'd mess with, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Evian Christ, Revanchist. Alright, Evian Christ is the alias for Ellesmere Port-based experimental producer Joshua Leary. He got a following in the early 2010s for his particularly boundary-pushing and impressive trap productions on his projects like his Waterfall EP, which there's honestly an outside chance I might have even been cool with if I'd known it existed at the time, despite hating trap music back then. The success of his early work led him to get really high-profile production credits on projects like Kanye West's Yeezus, Travis Scott's Birds in the Trap Sing McKnight, and Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition. But it's clear he wasn't too comfortable with the spotlight he was being put in, as we got years of radio silence in terms of any new material. Now, over a full decade after his initial breakout, he's finally seen fit to release his proper debut album, and I'd seen a lot of buzz and anticipation surrounding it. Now, truth be told, while I'd heard of Evian Christ in passing a few times before this project was announced, this was my first time hearing a project of his for myself. I really didn't have any idea what to expect. I'll tell you what I was not expecting, though, was a dedicated, somewhat experimental tribute to the world of trance music. Direct influences credited in the album's promo include Sasha's Expander and Madonna and William Orbit's Ray of Light. They've made sure to credit William Orbit in particular. Names like Tiesto and BT are dropped in other professional reviews. There's even a goddamn cover of Silence by Delirium on this thing. For a project released on Warp Records, all of this feels very strange, but it turned out to be great, repurposing all the appeal and classic sound palettes from trance music through the 90s and 2000s into a more off-kilter and experimental angle that maybe feels even more bombastic and cinematic than a lot of the projects it's taking influence from. The kind of thing that could appeal to those fans of more artsy and experimental artists that Warp is known for promoting, who maybe wouldn't typically be giving regular trance albums the time of day. I also feel like hyperpop fans are likely to fuck with this too. Like, a couple of tracks here, like The Beach, and especially that one with the guest feature from Blade, have a lot of very plastic-sounding vocal processing, and a particular keening texture to the lead synth tones that remind me a little more of the Sophies and Danny L. Harls of the world than the Ferry Corstens. The pitched-up nightcore vocals on the track with Blade was not my thing at all, but aside from that cut, I found myself really easily getting into this stuff. The production on this project is beautiful. It sounds really huge and expansive, just like all the all-time best trance classics, and tracks like Nobody Else, Run Boys Run, and The Silence cover really lean into that expansive ambience. The latter reimagines the original Delirium track as if it were some kind of Solar Fields type ambient epic, and the vocal performance from Daniel Blaze is a lot more childlike than the original Sarah McLachlan vocal. But there's also tracks that introduce much more experimental textures, like how On Embers is covered in all these blasts of percussive bass that go super hard, and remind me of certain, like, modern-day Patricia Taxon productions, and also sticks in all these old R&B samples in the cracks in between. Or that unpronounceable sixth track that combines a similar mix with all these classic breakbeat workouts. All this stuff sounds super clean and well-polished, as well as monumentally imposing. That track and the opener are the very easy biggest highlights for me. And there's also the track With Me, which plays the trance formulas much more straight and feels like it's a step away from hitting on like an early 2000s Paul Van Dyke kind of appeal. The whole project is definitely coming at this decades-old style in such a way where I can tell it was made very recently and comes from someone who has more nostalgia for the style than someone who is more actively part of the scene in its heyday, but it's definitely approaching all these sounds full-heartedly, and you can tell Evian Christ really loves this kind of music. It certainly conveys a level of passion for the actual soundcraft that you're unlikely to get out of the most popular trance artists actually on the scene these days. We'll see how long it sticks for me, but yeah, I can definitely co-sign this one. I'll let it off with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Marc Kellaway, Nocturnal Machines. Okay, Danish artist Marc Kellaway. I've covered this guy once before. In the Volume 8 roundup, I covered a project he put out called Body of Water, which was a particularly interesting ambient project inspired by the atmosphere of, like, indoor public pools, which were closed during the pandemic. Definitely a project that was able to set itself apart as its own unique thing in the grander scheme of the genre and stuck in my mind. And off its promise, I was definitely interested to hear what he might be doing to follow such a project up. Nocturnal Machines doesn't have a unique concept like Body of Water did. It just kind of presents itself like a regular ambient or IDM adjacent project without quite as specific imagery to build itself around. But it is about equally well crafted for what it's going for and might go even deeper in terms of its sound design than before. Part of what makes this project interesting is the fact that he's been interested in exploring making sounds from lots of different sources sound like other things, making it so that it can be hard to tell what instrument makes what sound. For example, more than half the tracks utilize prepared piano performances, but they're often made to sound just like the electronic percussion he's crafted through his synthesizers. A lot of blurring between the synthetic and the organic on this thing. Most of these tracks do focus on very simple ambient drones with various glitchy and tactile low-key percussion workouts that can possibly feel somewhat improvisational without really adhering to any kind of structure, and as a result a lot of these cuts can maybe sound kind of similar, the album might fall in the background a little bit, but there's definitely a lot of interesting ideas and varied takes on its core formula, either lower key and more delicate takes on these sounds explored on tracks like the title track or Night Drift, or Inside the Green Terrarium. The latter has some neat flute passages. There's tracks which get a little harsher and more exciting and even implement saxophones as heard on tracks like Lanterns or Viewed from the Staircase. A cut like Underwater Passage makes the inclusion of prepared pianos more obvious and ends up with a more organic texture as a result. In Praise of Shadows goes almost full ambient drone with less defined texture than the other tracks here, but still maintains the peaceful nocturnal vibe of the album. And the easy highlight of this project for me has to be By Train at Dusk. The build-ups and rhythms on this one get particularly epic and expansive and even start to remind me of like classic Ultimate Records productions. So yeah, overall another really solid effort from Kellaway. If you're looking for some particularly moody but tactile and subtly textured ambient material, this is definitely worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Give Me Monaco, the Nostos tapes. Small-time micro-house artist Give Me Monaco has really been impressing me as of late, both with the pair of Inferno and Luminance EPs he put out at the end of last year and beginning of this year respectively. A lot of really nice melodies and textures throughout those, and I've kept wanting to come back to them more and more. But also that project he did in collaboration with Yarny earlier this year called Parentheses, which was really dang solid too and has been marginally growing on me since I covered it in the Volume 11 roundup. But now we have something of a bonus album from him, a collection of 8 tracks from deeper in his unreleased archives, all apparently composed quite a while before his proper debut in 2020 from The Coral to the Grey. And while it's not difficult to tell that this is unreleased archival material from how often it feels less refined production-wise than the stuff he's putting out now, it's still hitting on pretty much the same appeal as his other stuff, and there's plenty of quality to be found here. There may be tracks which kind of fall flat for me, like how Mimic feels a bit too plain and run-of-the-mill as far as its house formula goes, or how Heath, on the opposite end, feels cluttered to the point of getting harder to listen to. Not really a fan of the synth organs on that one, even if there are cool progressions and change-ups floating through the track. But on the other hand, there are tracks that were able to hit on their simpler minimalism, like the opener 4. There's tracks which might have specific elements that might feel slightly off to me, but still end up winning me over, like how Kite's melodic progressions feel a little oddly high-pitched and awkward in a way that's hard to put my finger on, but still sift through enough varied textures that come together for a suitably chill groove. Or how Allocate starts off kind of throwing me off with its almost sitar-like chord stabs, but totally wins me over once that whole bridge with the synth strings comes in, and ends up surprisingly really sticking the landing as a closer. Or Barry, which builds itself around really obvious fake MIDI pianos. But I'm not one to be bothered too much by MIDI pianos anyway. I still like the chords they play and the way the whole track builds up. But there's also 2 tracks which are good enough to theoretically be sold as if he came out with them now, in Peer and Going. The grooves on these cuts are really solidly organic and textured and full-sounding and satisfying, even working in the slightly garish organ tones in a way that sounds more natural. And Going in particular really takes you on a journey over its 7+ minutes with lots of interesting change-ups that keeps you guessing where it might be heading next. I think I'd be lying if I said the Nostos tapes was an absolute must-listen. It's clear he's improved significantly from both a technical and compositional standpoint since the time when he originally put these tracks together, but I still had a fun time with this project. There's enough good stuff where I feel like if you've enjoyed any of his work in the past, it'll at least be worth one listen to browse through. So I'll let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Apashe, Antagonist. I'm not entirely sure what possessed me to give this one a shot. A while back I heard this guy's 2018 Requiem EP off the recommendation of Landon Remixes, putting it on a list we put together of 50 essential electronic projects from throughout the 2010s. I heard its combination of extravagant and high-energy full orchestral renditions of Mozart's Requiem in D minor, with all these of-the-time bombastic trap beats and braggadocious guest rap verses, and I could barely process what the fuck I was even listening to. I thought it was one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever heard in my life. The idea was being approached with such genuine self-confidence and enough love and effort put into it where I felt like I could give it a pass. It was clear Apashe thought this was the coolest shit ever and was giving it his all, but I could not take it seriously in any capacity. While the crossover did make some kind of sense given the bombastic and occasional orchestral tone you could hear in certain strains of trap music, I found the tonal mismatch between rapping and Mozart to be really off-putting and more laughably tasteless than anything. He apparently went on to stretch that idea out to a full album called Renaissance in 2020, which I skipped over. But now he has another album which looks to be in a similar vein yet again. I guess I decided to give it a shot out of morbid curiosity, and well, if you ever wanted to hear what Apashe style translated to the trends of 2023 sounds like, you got it here. Actually, it might be interesting to note that now that the novelty of his style is worn off, it turns out this album is really boring. The orchestral parts are still really bombastic and over-the-top and possibly take from a number of familiar classical pieces, but the level of over-the-topness feels toned down to a level that doesn't feel as actively off-putting as it initially did. It kind of just feels more stodgy and dull. It's nowhere near as evocative as something like that last Koan Sound project, but they also still feel like an unfitting match for the more modern electronic elements in the guest vocalists. Tracks like Catch Me jumping between orchestras and trendy house drops still feel really jarring, like they're just being put next to each other rather than naturally blended together. And as it turns out, the electronic and pop elements feel way more currently trendy and radio-friendly than before. Take out the orchestras, and a lot of these ideas just feel rotely pulled out of stuff you'd hear on that last Skrillex album, for instance. And done worse. Occasionally, you'll also get vocal performances that feel like they have no business being on these kinds of instrumentals, like Leah being laughably out of place on Kryptonite, or that James Blake Sampha wannabe on Lost in Mumbai. Even some of the ones you'd think would fit better don't really. I don't know why Busta Rhymes' voice on the opener was mixed to sound like he has laryngitis. There are a couple of tracks I think are alright. The rap and orchestral parts on tracks like Revenge of the Orchestra and Gasoline might not fit together, but I could get behind both halves of the equation individually. And there are two tracks where I felt like the pop or trap classical crossover actually did work somewhat naturally in Fracture and R.I.P. Those went pretty hard and might actually be kinda good. But 2 pretty good tracks out of 14 feels too little too late, and on the whole I'm still left feeling like that element of passion that allowed me to give the Requiem EP a pass isn't really here to the same extent. I guess if you were already a really big fan of Apashe before now, then this album might still hit for you. I certainly didn't find the experience to be like offensive or cringeworthy, but whatever spark the guy had that might have marginally interested me before isn't really there anymore, and the results are just kind of dull more than anything. Not the worst thing I've ever heard, but not really fun to listen to either. I don't think I can recommend it in earnest, and I'm feeling like a strong 4.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Daniel Bachman, When the Roses Come Again. Daniel Bachman really impressed me right near the end of last year when he put out his album Almanac Behind, a concept album about climate change and the directly tangible effects of the more extreme weather the entire world has seen, combining field recordings, radio broadcasts, folksy steel guitar and violin performances evoking the American countryside where he grew up, and foreboding ambient drones. It so vividly captured its concept in such a down-to-earth manner and created such a specifically unique vibe that I never heard out of any other album in existence, which immediately put it in contention with my favorite albums of 2022 as a whole, eventually notching an honorable mention on my year-end list. So when I saw that he'd put out a follow-up a year later, I figured I'd have to check it out. And well, there's no climate change concept behind this one, or any of those emergency broadcast samples or field recordings, which by default makes it a less vivid or interesting listen, but the overall vibe, trying to hit upon the crossover between Appalachian folk music and experimental ambient drone music, is still present and well done. I feel like trying to talk about individual tracks on this thing might be kind of a futile effort, since all these tracks basically run together as part of a single continuous piece without really standing apart from each other in that meaningful a way. Even the song titles all come together to form rhyming lyrics to a folk song, even if the music itself has no lyrics. But still, just taking the project in and sinking into its vibe is plenty effective on its own, floating through cuts based around lonely improvisational banjo performances, tracks based around fiddle drones, or more electronically processed ambience which gets really heavy and foreboding, even some tracks which start to bring in more experimental synths and glitch work. The project alternatively feels really intense and imposing, or rustic and comforting, or both depending on the section you're listening to. The banjos and guitars keep slightly changing their tone and texture from track to keep things from ever running together too much, and all of that still adds up to one singular unique vibe that I guess I really only hear out of an artist like Daniel Bachman. I wouldn't say this project is as much of a must-listen as his last one, but it does recapture a lot of what I liked about it and stands on its own, so yeah, if folk-tinged experimental ambient drone still sounds like the kind of thing you'd like, then give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Sofia Kourtesis, Madres. Alright, here we have the latest Ninja Tune House project to really start making some noticeable waves. I've seen a lot of buzz for this Peru-born, Berlin-based producer and her debut album here lately. The story behind this album mentioned in its promo is certainly inspiring, obviously given the title it's named after her mother, who apparently got diagnosed with cancer while Kourtesis was touring. She scrambled to find a doctor. Most of them told her that it was likely too late and that an operation was likely too risky. until she eventually found a neurosurgeon whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce. She apparently got his attention through a snippet of her music, which she directly sent to him and even promised to dedicate to him if he'd give him a moment of his time. And he very soon after agreed to operate on her mother, successfully saving her life. Damn. To match that emotional feel-good story is a collection of very breezy and pleasant and uplifting house music that definitely has a lot of heart put into it, and that I'm kind of left wishing that I was into as much as everyone else seems to be. Look, I like the album. I'll even say it's grown on me the more I've sat with it, but I wouldn't go so far as to say I love it. It's just another solid house project to add on to the increasingly oversized pile of solid house projects we've gotten this year. I don't know if it really rose that far above the crowd for me, aside from maybe a couple of moments. There's a bunch of tracks here I'm kind of ambivalent on, like the mix of horn sections and chord stabs on Estación Esperanza that felt a little messy and unkempt. Tracks like The Closer, El Carmen, and that one named after the neurosurgeon, which felt a little too plain in their straightforward atmospheric house blends, with breezy Kelly Lee Owen-style vocals or sample chops that didn't really stick out to me one way or the other. The ambient-leaning Moving Houses briefly tanked the pacing and feels like it should have been an interlude instead of a full song. And Habla con Ella has all these voice snippets in the background talking about like, share, and subscribe, which did not freaking need to be there. I don't know if that was like an attempt at social commentary or whatever. It was eye-roll inducing either way and brought down a track that otherwise probably would have been a highlight. But I do have to give credit for the moments here that do really hit. Tracks like the title track and Funk House were particular growers. The former hits on a lot of serene melodic layers, and the latter gets some really deep and satisfying grooves in. And a track like Si Te Portas Bonito combines the strengths of both together. How music makes you feel better went for a lot more of like a UK garage sound that feels like if a classic burial track was unambiguously happy. But my favorite track on this thing by a long shot has to be Cecilia. The mix of that minor key chord progression with those much prettier pianos and other slightly jazzier electric pianos felt like they were hitting on an even deeper and maybe more desperate feeling emotional note than even most of these other tracks. That one definitely got to me. I am definitely left kind of conflicted by the project as a complete whole. It's got its share of weak points and other issues holding it back for me. And once again, we're not really starving for quality house music in 2023. This isn't exactly doing anything sonically that I'm not already getting by a number of other projects this year. But I won't deny the cuts here that did hit still made the whole thing worth sitting through anyway. I think I ended up enjoying this project on a similar level of depth to one of her kinda sorta label mates, LPGOB, earlier this year. This obviously isn't nearly as radio-friendly as that album, but it personally hit me on a comparable emotional level and felt roughly equally as consistent, so take that all as you will. A lot of people seem to be a lot more into this than I am in any case, so maybe give it a shot in case it ends up hitting more for you as well. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. Next up from Matmos, Return to Archive.
Injection. Basic sound.
Alright, we got a new Matmos record. The legendary experimental duo are back again a little over a year after their last project. The concept behind this one isn't really too far removed from what they did last time, though instead of taking from the archives of one specific Polish composer, they've seen fit to dig through the broader archives of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, a label founded in 1948 dedicated to any kind of music or sounds from around the world. And as you might expect, Matmos went specifically through the non-musical portions of the archive and pulled up hundreds of sound effects, ranging anything from dolphins and frogs and telephones to spoken narration to speech after the removal of the larynx. Basically, it's a Matmos record. If you've heard any project of theirs in the past, you'll know exactly what you're getting, and I had my usual reaction to this that I typically do to any Matmos album, mostly respect from a distance, with certain tracks being really nice and others being more of a turnoff. I like the playful grooves made out of random sound effects in the intro track and Injection Basic Sound. A track like Why got much more foot tapping with its various glitches and radio snippets. The title track strings together loads of different field recordings from birds to lawnmowers to helicopters over a 13-minute ambient piece. And Lend Me Your Ears technically has some melodic elements provided by barely present pianos and old-timey recordings singing the title, even if it is just as predictably disorienting as you'd think. Reminds me of certain moments from The Consuming Flame. On the other hand, there's tracks like Mud Dauber Wasp, which has all this ear-grating buzzing that drove me up the fucking wall. Music or Noise does a cool Steve Reich face-shifting thing with some narrated snippets at first, but really loses me when those samples of someone screaming their lungs out started to come in. And Closer Going to Sleep was nearly a highlight in the parts that actually went for something more musical through the more climactic sample matchups it starts and ends with. But I wasn't really interested in the lengthy sections dedicated to some, like, relaxation recording of a narrator softly instructing you how to go to sleep. The experience I got out of this project definitely feels like lots of other Matmos projects I've heard over the years and doesn't really explore any approaches to these sounds that I wouldn't already expect out of them. It's not a winner on the level of Plastic Anniversary, Ultimate Care 2, or A Chance to Cut is a Chance to Cure, and I don't really see myself hanging on to it. But it's not among their weakest work either. I did like it more than their last project, just thanks to the more playful whimsicality this one provided. It felt looser and less serious than that last one in a good way. And hey, if you've never heard a Matmos album before and aren't already used to the crazy inventive sound effect mashups they're known for delivering, this could definitely make for an effective introduction to what they're all about and a demonstration of what sets them apart from literally anyone else in the entire world of music at large. It's not their best, but it's still roughly as fun a time as I would hope any new Matmos project would be, and I'll let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from SCJ, RAVEDADA. Next up in the pile of random house recommendations I've gotten is this project, which I discovered after seeing Ryan from Not Real Music posting about it offhand. This is a producer based in Austin who's been putting stuff out for about a decade now, but I think this is their 5th proper album. I haven't heard any of their stuff beyond this project. Anyway, this particular album definitely has a very different flavor from any of the other house projects I'm covering in this roundup. This stuff has a lot more of like that old 2000s Eurodance-ish edge with the beats and synths feeling way crisper and harsher than the way more vibe-centric approach to the Ninja Tune stuff I've covered elsewhere in this video. As the title implies, it's a lot more about those old rave cliches, from 90s house pianos to classic breakbeats, going up next to standard house beats and whatnot, and it really nails down tons of hard-hitting grooves in the process. It feels like the Super Monkey Ball soundtrack in particular was a big inspiration on this thing, especially when the track Big Bumpin' comes up and you hear all these samples of sound effects from Super Monkey Ball. That track was easily my least favorite here. Those cutesy-ass voice snippets from the monkeys themselves were really squeaky and annoying and did more to distract from the experience, but whatever. While the other tracks here give me very little to say or break down, they all go hard. From the various synth stabs and stomping percussion going through tracks like Weekend Rentals and Polyethylene and the closer Crazed, a track like Gone, which has a particularly catchy sample, a track like Tenet slightly tones down the energy but also brings in these punchy MIDI horn sections, a track like Objective/Execution, which gets a lot more spacey and classic trance-like, Sinful City's Day/Night makes for an effective lower key breather like main menu music to contrast the more bombastic grooves found elsewhere. And I think my favorite track here was Penultimate Cut, Thick and Thin. That one feels like a little bit of an emotional culmination the rest of the project was leading up to, and I was kind of left wishing that was the closer instead. While I don't know if this stuff is going to be sticking with me longer term, it was plenty of fun in the moment, and I can definitely recommend it to any fans of artists like Naked Flames or that kind of thing. Solid stuff for sure. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Laurel Halo, Atlas. Laurel Halo is a producer from Ann Arbor, Michigan who's been at it since the end of the 2000s, but really broke out in the early 2010s through her projects released on the Hyperdub label. First through her well-acclaimed 2012 debut Quarantine, which saw her combining lots of experimental ambient material with her own completely untouched vocal performances, creating a particularly disorienting but intriguingly unique, not really synth pop atmosphere. Then in 2013 she followed it up with Cans of Rain, which saw her switching into entirely instrumental experimental techno, with a sound palette that definitely fit more at home on Hyperdub in particular. Then in 2017 we got Dust, which kind of delivered something in between the first two projects. I guess it's technically her most accessible record by merit of consistently having vocals, melodies, and beats, but it's still pretty dang out there and takes all number of strange, like, jazz-influenced turns. Also, Julia Holter, of all people, was brought on to play cello on one track. There's been other projects she's released, including a smattering of EPs, a soundtrack, a mini-album in 2018 called Raw Silk Uncut Wood, which I didn't listen to, etc. But this project is marked as their fourth proper studio album, also her first one to be independently released through her new Awe imprint. And this one goes for an entirely ambient and modern classical approach. Perhaps some of those other smaller projects which I didn't listen to made for more direct hints at this direction, but the results are pretty strikingly different from any of her other main albums. Nearly all these tracks sound like they're made entirely out of achingly slow pads of orchestral strings with little touches of synths and pianos and saxophones in the background. There's not really much structure variety, aside from a couple of shorter tracks such as Belleville and You Burn Me that go for more of a solo piano approach, and the former of those also bringing in some vocal harmonies care of Kobe Say in its second half. There's barely anything to break down with pretty much any of this material, and all of it totally runs together. Though on some level it does kind of feel like the point. It is an ambient album at the end of the day, designed to just more sink yourself into. And for the most part, all these pieces are sufficiently pretty enough for me to consistently get pulled in anyways. Other highlights include Sick Eros, which takes a darker tone than the earlier tracks and brings in slightly more complex orchestration in its last minute and a half. The title track, which feels particularly expansive and stormy. And the closer Earthbound, which makes for an effective emotional finish. I'm not going to say this is among the most evocative ambient projects I've heard this year or among the best electronic orchestral crossovers of the year either, but I can't really complain about the particular way it was executed, and I think it worked quite well for what it was going for, so I'll just let it get away with a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Loraine James, Gentle Confrontation. While we're on the topic of female experimental artists who found a bit of a cult following through releasing on Hyperdub, Loraine James is a British producer I've technically talked about once before when I covered her ambient techno side project under the name Whatever the Weather back in the Volume 8 roundup last year. I did very briefly touch on her mainline work under her own name in that segment, though I did make sure to come back to re-listen to her previous albums a little more closely in order to reconfirm my feelings before jumping into a new project. While I'd have a lot of the exact same things to say about each one, she definitely sticks to unique blends of sounds that sets herself apart from the crowd, combining elements of broken beat, grime, glitch, footwork, and more, often taking textures pulled from classic 90s IDM and ambient techno and deep house and the like, but completely deconstructing them from the ground up and scattering them about in lots of highly abstract and off-kilter mixes, often including loose explorations into themes of her identity as a queer black woman. While I did often find myself somewhat emotionally detached from the material on her first handful of albums and maybe found them to be a little on the listless side for my liking, I did think they got progressively better and better refined. Her debut in 2017, Detail, acting as a looser and more unpolished proof of concept for her sound. For You and I in 2019, getting much better polished and well-detailed and nailing down her specific style. Reflection in 2021, as per the title, getting a fair bit more introspective, especially thanks to her half-mumbled vocals showing up on several tracks, kind of musing about her own self-doubt and that kind of thing. Obviously, Whatever the Weather was where I first got pulled in. Her exploration of classic 90s ambient techno sounds may have felt less unique and more beholden to her influences, but did feel a fair bit more sonically striking. And then later last year she put out Building Something Beautiful for Me, which might have been even better, specifically acting as an homage and repurposing of the work of composer Julius Eastman that felt like a further deepening of her usual sound and style that also got more pointed in its political messaging. I think that currently stands as my personal favorite of her work so far. Now, about a year after that project, we have Gentle Confrontation, which looks to be her densest and biggest scale album yet, a meaty collection of 17 tracks adding up to just over an hour, getting even more ambitious, getting lots more vocal guests from the R&B and hip-hop world, both familiar faces who've shown up on previous Loraine James projects, as well as plenty new ones. Though the only one I'd heard of previously was Nathaniel Ritchie of Injury Reserve fame. And there are also some marginally bigger names in the behind-the-scenes credits thanks to her sampling them, including Lucine, Dintel, and Telephone Tel Aviv, the latter also handling mastering on the whole project. Certainly the bigger scale and wider variety on display throughout this project makes it a pretty inherently fun listen, though as often tends to be the case with projects that have this many tracks, the project can maybe be a little hit and miss. There are lots of standouts. The project starts out really strong in the combination of lush strings and amen breaks on the title track, and the warmer abstract hip-hop approach on 2003. A lot of the vocal guests are able to add their own unique flavors and deepen the album's vibe. See the smoother and airier performances from Marina Herlop and Eden Samara on While They Were Singing and Try For Me respectively. Do really like how the former cut's beat work gets a little heavier and more hard-hitting, and how both of these tracks kind of feel like two parts of the same whole. Also like the warmer and somewhat more nasal R&B performance from Contour on closer Saying Goodbye, and as mentioned before, there's also Richie on the track Deja Vu. While there were a couple of goofy ad-libs on that track that slightly took me out of that one, I still definitely appreciate his presence here for variety's sake. And of course, Loraine is still able to deliver plenty of nice stuff on her own, either through her own vocal tracks like how she glitches herself up and Glitch the System Glitch Bitch 2, or brings in samples from her grandparents on Cards with the Grandparents, and talks about like how one of them is suffering from dementia but is still cool and she very much cherishes her time with them. But of course, more pressingly through the instrumental tracks, there's some really nice textures cuts like IDMU, which gets crisper and more viscerally hard-hitting thanks to some live drumming care of Morgan Simpson from Black Midi, or the more liquid melodic textures and guitar backing on One Way Ticket to the Midwest Emo, or the low-key chopped-up dub techno synths and beats on I'm Trying to Love Myself. Also, the bonus track Skepticism with Joy brings in Japanese post-rock band Mouse on the Keys for a much jazzier and dreamier finish that I think makes for an even better closer than the track with Contour on it. But on the other hand, there are also plenty of tracks that didn't really move me one way or the other, be it the processed vocals on Let You Go, feeling like they're in a different key from the B and undercutting the vibe, Speechless, just feeling kinda aimless and dull with a beat switch in the middle that left little to no impact, weighing down the pacing enough for me to feel a bit of an urge to skip. Or tracks from Loraine on her own that, while very solid in a vacuum, kind of blend into the average sound of everything else too much to stand out for me in contexts such as Tired of Me or Disjointed Feeling Like a Kid Again. In general, while I am enjoying the wider sonic variety on display and felt like there are plenty of individual standouts that were able to hit me on a more visceral level, on average, it did once again not really have me as emotionally invested as I wanted to be. Just like her older albums, I'm left wanting to love it, but don't think I'm all the way there with it. The kind of thing I have plenty of respect for, but on a personal level, it's merely nice and pleasant and not necessarily exciting me. But it is absolutely one of the better projects I've heard from her as of yet. I got more out of this than I did out of her first three albums, which, to be clear, were also pretty good in their own right, so I guess take that all as you will. I don't think it's a personal keeper, but there is lots of really good stuff here, and I definitely came out of it glad I sat with it as much as I did. I'm sure her more in-depth fans will get a lot more out of it than I did as well. If you've missed it, it's worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Katia Krow, Klaus Borealis. Alright, got a new project from Dubai ambient artist Katia Krow. We've come off the heels of his previous album Yulfar, which came out near the end of last year, which marked a noticeable turn in the direction of noise music. The mix is getting markedly louder, more distorted, less melodic, and less to my personal taste, although still clearly maintaining the core of what made his previous projects connect with me before. Even if it wasn't a home run on the level of his debut, I've called off the search I Know Exactly Where You Are, I still thought it was cool enough for what it was. This new project, however, marks yet another big sonic shift in the exact opposite direction. As the album cover implies, this project sort of has a loose space concept, apparently just the first volume in what may later be built upon in a series called Music for Bleary-Eyed Stars. And the results are far more pleasant and laid back. You're not gonna get any experimental noise on this one, it's all just very warm and comforting synth blends with a couple of tracks, namely the opener and closer, featuring a little bit of guitar. Now, in theory, that sounds like it'd appeal more to me, being much more accessible and all, though it actually turned out to be more of a lateral move that I think I enjoyed about equally as much as Yulfar. I feel like I'm getting mixed messages from the artist on how important a new step this is actually supposed to symbolize. At this point, Katia Krow has already announced his next album coming out this January, and heavily hinted at that one being the real big event while pushing this release further down on his Bandcamp page below I've called off the search in Yulfar, which definitely furthers this feeling of this album possibly being a bit more of a side project in comparison with his previous two albums. And even if I didn't know a possible bigger event was on the horizon, I still would have gotten a little bit of the feeling of this release's comparative inconsequentiality. Sure, the mixes may be easier on the ears, but the emotional stakes feel significantly lower, the sound less distinct, and the scale of the project feels oddly small for being themed after space. But still, even with that in mind, I thought it was pretty nice for what it was going for. There's still plenty of standouts to be had here, be it the peaceful guitars on the opener, the synth blurs on Ragged Silver Starline, the somewhat Boards of Canada-y ambient keyboard meanderings on Beehive Orbit and Garden's Tilted Exit Light, the filtered washes passing through Dust Grazier like shooting stars, and the more delicate pianos on Trail Collision Lines going up next to harsher melodic synth progressions. And the one track here that does the best job of evoking that whole spacey vibe with its wider expanse is the longest cut, Stardals for the Archaic Billions. I think that one stands as my favorite cut here. The rest kind of has the tendency to fall in the background without leaving as much of an impression, I guess. At the end of the day, this is another likable effort from Katia Krow that does hit on the particular emotional note it's going for, while distinctly setting itself apart from his other albums. While in the grander scheme of ambient music, this admittedly isn't anything to super write home about, and doesn't feel as essential an effort as I would have hoped. I mean, it still gets the job done for what it's going for, so I think there's enough here for me to, just barely get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Barry Can't Swim, When Will We Land? For the last of the random Ninja Tune signees covered today, we have Barry Can't Swim, real name Joshua Maney, a Scottish producer who's been getting a reasonable enough amount of buzz through his commercial house-leaning work. I was mildly intrigued by what he might be delivering, given how much more overtly quirky his presentation seems to be in comparison to his label mates. And a lot of the promos seem to imply he was putting together a fairly diverse listen. And, I mean, yeah, it is decently diverse, but the longer I've sat with this project, the more something has just kind of felt off about it. Like its presentation was trying to sell me a more interesting listening experience than this artist could actually deliver. That's obviously not to take away from all the standouts that are present here. I do really like all the fluttering pianos on the title track, forming a relatively abstract and complex intro to the project. I like the strings going up next to the thumping hip-hop breakbeats on I Won't Let You Down. And even if the gospel vocals going up next to the smartphone ad disco beats on Always Get Through to You initially felt a bit too commercial for my liking, I did warm up to it with repeat listens. And there's a really solid little run of tracks going from the piano-backed broken beat balladry on Sonder, to the classic deep house on How It Feels, to the track's biggest and most energetic moments in the stomping and playful kind of disco grooves of Sunsleeper. 3 big standouts back to back to back, and I really like how they all directly segue into each other in a way that feels like they're all just 3 parts of a bigger whole. But by the time we hit the album's biggest single, Woman, the album kind of started to lose me. That track in particular feels borderline plagiarized from the Against All Logic track, City Fade. Very similar piano rhythms, drum patterns, not really gospel sampling. The similarity is a little uncanny, actually. It's not close enough to be grounds for a lawsuit or anything. The actual chord progressions and melodies are totally different, as was the approach to the production. But the connection was close enough to be grounds for the track feeling kinda unoriginal, thereby preventing me from marking it as a highlight. The rest of this album is pretty mid and blends into the usual style of commercial house that Ninja Tune's been regularly pushing lately. A track like Deadbeat Gospel sounds like something that Disclosure would have come up with the standard house instrumental and the rambling from some deadbeat on top of it. The ending stretch is really weak as we get a generic 80s influence pop cut and Tell Me What You Need, another smartphone ad disco cut and Dance to the Grab, which disappointingly sounds nothing like The Fat of the Land, and gets kinda grating in its particular sample flips. And Closer Defined Dancing makes for a total anticlimax snoozer of a finish. At the end of the day, for all I've said both positively or negatively on the tracks on this album, I don't really feel all that strongly about it one way or the other. It's just alright. And like I've said multiple times in this video, we're not exactly starving for quality house music. For a project that sounds like this to stick with me in such a house-rich environment, it's really gotta go the extra mile in some way. Really exemplify why this sound is as popular as it is instead of just unambitiously riding the trend. And I don't think Barry Can't Swim has quite done enough to really impress me yet. There's already multiple examples of better house music to choose from, even just exclusive to what I've mentioned in this video. Romy, SEJ, Sofia Kourtesis. In the latter segment, I compared that album to LPGOB's album. which sounds really similar to this one, and quite frankly does this radio pop house sound a fair bit better if you ask me. This is not a bad album by any stretch. It's decent at worst and has its standout moments. If this had come out any time before, say, 2017, I probably would have gone to bat for it a lot more, but in late 2023, this berry is kind of lost in a wider ocean of house music, and it's clearly going to take some work for him to not drown in it. I'm overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Danny Days, Blue. Danny Days is a producer and DJ from Miami who's technically been putting out work since at least the late 2000s and has been actively DJing since the end of the 90s. He's done work in collaboration with artists like Gigamesh and Anthony Rother, among many others, and has been managing his own Omnidisc label since 2014. But this is only his debut album here, supposedly 24 entire years in the making. Which may or may not just be a slight exaggeration. I feel like that might be more to say that he's been in the producing game for 24 years, not necessarily working on the same album for that long. Apparently he had a debut album finished in 2013, but he scrapped it in its entirety. Though this has still clearly been cooking for a very long time, as he had 100 tracks composed for it, edited down to the 19 included here. Truth be told, I never actually heard of Danny Days before I saw this project show up in the new music section of iTunes. Seeing the 90-minute track listing and previewing through the wholly experimental ambient techno and glitch style on display with the promise of a seamless continuous mix to which the album was originally designed to be experienced had me intrigued, so I threw it in here. I should hope an hour and a half of pure sound design workouts with as long a development cycle as it's purported to have should be as impressive and immersive as possible. And thankfully, yeah, it's a great time. It's not as flashy a listen as one might expect. This stuff is actually pretty low-key and stripped back for what it is. If you're here for, like, big, exciting, and driving danceable beat work, there's not really much in the way of that. It's very much a home listening kind of project. But the sound palette itself is really clean and crisp and sticks to a lot of sounds that you'd expect out of modern-day kind of commercial-leaning techno productions, albeit completely deconstructing them from the ground up, each track giving you quite a bit of sonic depth with plenty of intricate details to pay attention to. Be it tracks focusing more on buzzing glitches like Opener Tone Ring, or the much more abstract Entity, tracks which build themselves around very moody and atmospheric slower-paced dance formulas, as seen on Exosphere, Fizmo, or Fukushima. The latter feels like a standard techno track, like stretched out and slowed down, but it keeps you guessing where it might progress next. There's a lot of substance to that one, I feel like. There's tracks which have more in the way of melodic texture, be it the spacey pads on Drowning Again and Silver Box, the atmospheric looping vocoders on I'm Fallen, or the tinier and more well-defined melodies on Functional Closer Time Lapse. And there are even cuts that do include a much heavier and more hard-hitting groove, such as Communication and Nobot Nobot, even if they are on the shorter side. Also, Room 115 makes for a particularly impressive lengthy centerpiece to the album. There are tracks which didn't interest me as much and kinda let its abstract glitch work fall in the background a bit more, like 1, 2, 3, 4, Smack, or Blue Orbit. And there is one track early on in Las Los that has all this German whispering that does more to take me out of the experience. Not a fan of that. But ultimately, I'm still pulled in by the vibe of everything, and each of these tracks gives me enough tangible to latch onto where I wouldn't feel the urge to skip them. Obviously, if you can go for the full continuous mix, that's the way to go, even if these tracks were clearly written separately enough where it's pretty easy to tell when any given transition is. And also releasing said mix through a QR code included in the Bandcamp download is maybe somewhat unorthodox. But on the other hand, there are a number of tracks that will likely feel too abortive if you take the unmixed version. We'll see how well this does for me replay value-wise, but I'm definitely open to hanging on to this one longer term. The album experience as a complete whole is interestingly hitting me on a similar note to something like Gaia's Moons of Jupiter, albeit with less melody and way more subtle glitchy abstraction in place of the big epic classic trance mixes. Maybe the lengthy continuous mix and all the computerized voices showing up throughout is doing more to put that comparison in my head than the actual sound and style of this thing, but it's still a comparison that came to mind, and I really like Gaia's Moons of Jupiter, so that is not a complaint. In any case, I really had to appreciate the journey this whole thing ended up taking me on, and all the years of effort that clearly went into it. It was just as up my usual alley as I hoped it would be, and I can definitely recommend giving it a shot yourself. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Apollo Vermouth, Forever Back There. This is an ambient project that's been recommended to me a couple of times by one of my regular commenters. This Milwaukee-based producer, real name Elisa Rodriguez, has apparently been putting out projects semi-regularly since 2012, but this was a bit of a comeback release, being her first full album since 2017, mostly recorded through the pandemic. I haven't listened to any of her other projects aside from this one. I kind of just jumped into it out of curiosity. My thoughts on this project admittedly aren't too far away from other ambient projects I've covered elsewhere in this video, such as the Daniel Bachman and Katia Krow things. If you like those, you'll like this as well. Though there is some distinction between this album's approach and those others. For one thing, there's a lot of fuzzy shoegaze influence going into this project, which can give it a little bit of like a Tim Hecker, Radio Amore, Harmony, and Ultraviolet kind of feel. But it also feels like it arguably might have the highest emotional stakes out of the ambient projects in this roundup. I will say it was not a project that stuck out to me immediately. At first I heard the pleasant ambient blends running through the first 4 tracks, and even if Year After Year is a particularly strong cut and I felt like I heard some melted vibraphone sounds in the background of it that I liked, and Solveig felt very serene and peaceful and worked very well for what it was going for, I was enjoying myself even more on second listen, but my first impression at this point had me wondering whether I'd actually have anything to say about this for a review. Once we hit the title track though, things start to take an interesting turn. The sound gets a little darker with these rhythmic pulses underscoring the whole composition. There's a noisy interlude of guitar feedback in Second Evening, and the last stretch did really stick with me a fair bit more as we got all the melted pianos on Blue Void, which were especially haunting, and the blockier drones of Loveless Forest and Never Alone, which seemed to convey quite a bit of emotional complexity in spite of how monolithic they seem on the surface, in true Tim Hecker tradition. And the closer Hills of Walden goes for a much more minimalistic approach in its single note pads floating around. It does make for a particular poignant finish. I may still be left at the end of this, not sure if this will be a long-term keeper, if only because, I obviously listen to a lot of music that sounds like this, but I at least enjoy this enough to give my thumbs up and a recommendation if all of this sounds like it'd be interesting to you. It's some good stuff. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, Bauhaus Staircase. Wow, OMD, been a while since I've talked about this band. I did once review their previous album, The Punishment of Luxury, and caught myself up on their whole back catalog in the process. Out of the videos I did marathoning's 80 synthpop legends in 2017, it's technically the one I'm least embarrassed by. While a lot of my thoughts on certain albums of theirs would actually probably be more ambivalent now than they were when I made that video, the band did still pretty well cement themselves in my mind. I know well why they're a favorite artist of many a favorite artist. They have their standout albums like Dazzle Ships, English Electric, and Organization, the former of those three definitely being the one I've come back to the most since then, and the latter was actually just a fair bit better than I remembered coming back to it just now, even though I haven't come back to it that much. Coming off the heels of The Punishment of Luxury, I definitely still have my issues with that album. I still think the social commentary is pretty shallow and ham-fisted. I still think that one track mashing up Kraftwerk's Antenna and Europe Endless felt a little lazy. But the classic electropop production on the whole thing still holds up, and the hooks and melodies are absolutely top-notch. It's good enough where I could still easily recall the tune to nearly every track on it, despite barely coming back to it at all since I put up my video 6 years ago. The fact that it's continued to stick in the public consciousness as long as it has, and is even semi-frequently marked as OMD's best album ever, honestly, that's pretty deserved. And I think I would stand by its honorable mention placement on my year-end list that year. In any case, my memories of their most recent work were all positive leaning enough that when I found out they had a new album, purported to possibly be their final album, I was definitely interested to hear what they'd have in store, even if I had a feeling that it probably wasn't going to be that much different from their last album. And yeah, this was pretty much exactly what I expected it to be. It's pretty much just a mix of the same sounds you've heard on their last 2 albums, and I think it's less well done than either of them. English Electric did the whole futuristic electropop style more immersively, and The Punishment of Luxury had far stickier hooks. This project, by comparison, has the feeling of leftovers that didn't make the cut for those two. Some of these tracks literally are. But, you know, I'm certainly not against hearing more in that same vein. The electropop grooves are no less hard-hitting and exciting as they were before, and the tunes are predictably solid as well. Well, most of them. There are a handful of tracks which don't really do much for me one way or the other, be it the airier ballads like Look at You Now or Healing, which, while nice, kind of pale in comparison to the ballads on their last album. or tracks which just sound like the generic average of everything they've done since their 2010 reformation and feel particularly uninspired, like Aphrodite's Favorite Child, or especially Don't Go. I'm not really a fan of that one. But at the same time, there are plenty of cuts that were in the same vein as all those, but were able to hit. The title track has a particularly sticky tune, and I like that line about kicking down fascist art. There's two really solid ballads in Where We Started, and especially Verushka, that were able to hit on that deeper emotional level. I think the latter was my favorite cut here. They're not afraid to touch on their playful side, on cuts like GEM and Slow Train. I wouldn't be surprised if some people find cuts like these, and especially the latter of those, to be cringe as hell, but I do like how hard their grooves go. And of course there's also the political cuts, the most overtly topical political tracks this band has ever done by far. Most notably Kleptocracy, which just straight up talks about money and politics overriding the will of the common people, and even makes a passing reference to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I did not see that coming. Wasn't really sure how I felt about that one, especially since this band strikes me as a little out of their depth trying to tackle the subject. But, I mean, I guess I can get behind the intention enough to give it a pass. I'll take that over the What If Phone Bad messaging on their last album. And it might be the single most propulsive cut in the bunch with one of the best tunes, so I can still probably mark it as a highlight. And there's also two tracks about, like, the impact of humankind on the Earth and climate change in Anthropocene and Evolution of Species, which go for a little bit of that Dazzle Ships approach and feature all these dry text-to-speech voices, which I guess are kind of interesting, add some extra flavor. Overall, I'm not going to come up and say Bauhaus Staircase is an absolute must-listen. Again, I do feel like their last two albums did a lot of the same ideas as these and pulled them off markedly better. This feels more like a postscript to add on to those than something that stands on its own as well, but it hits in all the same ways that all of OMD's other post-Reformation records do, and even if it turns out this ends up being their last project, I'm sure it'll be one that suitably pleases the fans and leaves them with a more dignified finish than many other bands of their age can attest to. At least it would be a better send-off than Universal was. So, I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this as well. Next up, from Kuatari, Kourtesis. Alright, for the last of the random Bandcamp racks, here we have this neuro IDM project made by this fairly small-time producer from Hawaii who initially found an audience through releasing on the Never Say Die label and putting out a debut album called Line Pulse on the label in 2021, which sounded pretty damn solid from what I've previewed through. But that label's not really a thing anymore, so Kuatari is releasing this sophomore project independently now. I'd seen someone in my comments talking about this as their favorite album of the year. It seemed interesting enough for me to give it a shot. And, yeah, it's a lot of fun. The best way I can describe this album is basically like if Culprate didn't have a big enough audience to pull in the budget for his Indiegogo campaigns, but still tried to go ahead with his most ambitious ideas anyway. There's tons of high-detail mixes of bombastic, upscale-type IDM and neuro and bass music in the vein of artists like Frequent and False Noise, with mixes filled out with a lot of extra faux movie soundtrack instrumentation, like strings and pianos and kalimbas and trumpets and steel drums and whatnot. Or rather, obvious cheaper synth imitations of all of those. But at least good enough sounding imitations to still work in that way. They're not too far away from the kind of ESTs you'd hear out of an artist like C418, for instance. Oh, and the artist also brings in their own live drumming and guitar playing on most of these tracks, if I'm not mistaken. There is a pretty overt prog rock flavor to a lot of these tracks as well. And the artist even delivers their own vocals on multiple tracks here, kind of delivering some loose concept about going on some big sailing adventure or something like that, I guess. The vocals do tend to make these tracks feel goofier than they would have otherwise, and did a bit more to distract from the experience than add to it for me. Especially when the artist goes on that whole corny, fast-flow rap verse in Soils Unknown / At Northeastern Wetlands, and keeps falling off beat every 2 seconds. Or that whole section in The Bloat that goes for this bombastic, edgy noise rock style and has all these lyrics about, "This is my suicide song," that I cannot take seriously. But aside from that, the results are every bit as impressive as you'd think it'd be. A lot of these tracks are more about crazy sound design than delivering memorable hooks, so there's a tendency for this album to run together a little bit, but there's still plenty of variety in terms of the sound. There's tracks that lean into the prettier and better textured soundtrack instrumentation like Draft Guide Zorro's Fires, or Blower's Plaza the Spark, or the above-mentioned Soils Unknown / At Northeastern Westlands. I do like some of the parts in the second half of that one. There's tracks that lean into that alongside more of the obvious prog flavors like For Cynthia's Caravan with JHL, or Almari Seek It and the City of a Million Isles. Those two probably have the most likable inclusions of vocals on this thing for me, even if in the former of those it's all wordless. There's multiple organic ambient leaning interludes in Overnets, It's a Long Swim Home, and The New Sail. The former of those three feels like a Vale Smith production without any percussion, so that's cool. And there's a full 8-minute ambient synth odyssey in He Learned in the Glass Archives, which I admittedly wish was more attention-grabbing than it actually was, but I still appreciate it being here. But there's obviously lots of more bombastic and intense moments, too. You got The Bloat again, going for noisier rock styles. You got the proper album opener, Little Seed Arrival Eaterock, which stretches on for over 11 minutes, tries to act as like an overture to all the sounds and styles you can expect to hear throughout this thing. Just as epic and fun a ride as you'd expect it to be. And actually, I think my favorite track here was one of the loudest ones, too. The Beast and the Four-Stringed Bandits. That probably touches the most into this artist's roots in modern EDM and rhythm styles, but also brings in some pretty heavy rock instrumentation as well. That goes really hard and has lots of complexity without ever undercutting itself. It's probably the one track here that I feel best exemplifies strengths that Kuatari can specifically bring to the table that I don't get to the same extent out of other artists in this scene. I may have my myriad of issues with this album, and I'm not sure if it's the kind of thing I'm going to keep around longer term, but it's abundantly clear the artist making it is really talented and put an absolute ton of effort into this over many years. It's such a clear labor of love with so much quality to digest that I still have to give it a high recommendation in spite of my issues with it. There is room for improvement, but this is still a great project, and anyone into these experimental neurostyles ought to check it out. I'll let it off with a solid 8 out of 10. And finally, from André 3000, New Blue Sun. Weren't expecting me to cover this one, were you? Oh, by the way, hi to all the people who don't regularly watch my videos that might be skipping over to this. My name's Tommy. This is a channel mostly about covering underground electronic music, and I tend to mostly center these Some Stuff I Missed roundups around finding hidden gems and bringing light to more obscure artists within that scene. If that sounds like the kind of thing you'd be interested in, you can feel free to click around elsewhere in this video. André 3000 is not typically the kind of artist I ever would have thought would make sense for me to review, and not necessarily just for the reason you'd think. Whenever artists who are really well known through their work in genres outside of electronic music try to dip their toes into the kind of stuff I cover, like The Weeknd making an 80s synth pop record, or Beyonce making a house and disco record, or Drake farting in my general direction, I've avoided covering them myself thanks to my not really having anything unique to say that any of my other reviewing colleagues on this platform couldn't already say as well. I'd rather spend more of my time looking into artists within my usual niche that no one else is covering to the same degree than just talk about the same stuff that everyone else does. On top of that, truth be told, I don't actually have that deep a history with OutKast. They're one of those outfits who have technically been in my life as long as I can remember, and I know lots of their songs through sheer cultural osmosis, but they've never really been that much of an integral part of my life, so much as they were just kind of there in the background when I grew up without me being cognizant of it. Their peak of popularity came and went at just the exact wrong times, resulting in OutKast never getting any attention in my family's household. Southern Playlistic came out the year before I was born, right when my rock music-loving dad stopped paying attention to popular music, and Idlewild came out the year I made my very first steps towards forming my own music taste when I was like 12, getting subsumed by bands like Orbital and Air. The first time I heard the name André 3000 was seeing an episode or two of his Cartoon Network show as a kid, and I only ever got around to hearing the first 3 OutKast albums in full for the first time once each about 5 years ago, and I still haven't gotten around to listening to Stankonia or Speakerbox Love Below in their full entirety. I've only heard a handful of tracks from each. However, what I have listened to a lot of is ambient music. I'm very well versed in this genre. It's pretty much this channel's bread and butter. There's 7 other projects I've covered in this video alone that qualify as ambient in some way. I'm even wearing a Brian Eno t-shirt today. Most of the people I've seen talking about New Blue Sun are obviously big OutKast fans, first and foremost, and for all too many of them, this will be literally the only ambient album they'll hear all year, if not just the only one ever for some. And big surprise, the majority of the discourse I've seen boils down to either, this album is great because André did something really unexpected that no one was ever asking him to do, or this album is terrible because there's no rapping on it and doesn't give me any of the things I used to enjoy in OutKast's music. or something to that effect. As likely the only person reviewing this project who is well-versed in ambient music, but not as much well-reversed in Outcast, and thereby doesn't really have a horse in that race, I felt like, for once, my perspective could genuinely add something of substance to the conversation this time. For what it's worth, even if I did have the standpoint of an Outcast superfan who grew up with them, I'd still be on the side of praising André for taking a big risk. He frankly already earned all my full respect the moment I found out that drum and bass version of My Favorite Things existed. But I digress. With all that in mind, do I like this album? Yeah, it's really good. I don't know about properly great or a long-term keeper, but yeah, I definitely enjoy my time with this thing. It's a solid project for sure. It is pretty different from the other ambient projects I've covered in this particular video, if only because of the much more organic, jazz-influenced sound palette. But it still very clearly falls within my format. There's smoother electronic textures on pretty much every track, and that's arguably the main focus of the album, including a lot of André's own flute performances, which are really a wind controller, a synth that sounds like and is played like a flute. On top of that, I'm obviously not the only one to make this observation, but it is interesting that André is going out of his way to make sure his presence is never the primary focus beyond just being another player in the ensemble he's a part of. In fact, he's making sure that his own presence isn't taken too seriously. And I don't just mean that through the ridiculous song titles, I mean just his actual performances. A lot of times throughout this album you can hear him, like, hitting notes that are off-key and, like, correcting himself, highlighting the mistakes that come with unrehearsed improvisational performance and intentionally making himself look like an amateur. Which in other cases might throw me off, but here I can see why that works for what he's going for thematically. He said that he specifically finds it cool to hear himself be a baby at something, and I have to respect that. The whole attitude of discovery, trying something new just because it feels right even if you don't quite fit in yet. I really like that outlook. It also means a lot of the heavy lifting is done by the other players in the ensemble, most notably co-producer Carlos Nino, who handles various percussive elements and is probably the other most well-known name here. He's done a lot of work for the International Anthem label. If you're looking for more music that sounds kind of like this, that label is almost certainly the first place I would recommend looking. While a lot of the appeal of this album is the attitude behind it, all the very laid-back and genuine positive energy trying to be sent out through the lead melodies that André plays, I feel like what I really liked the most about it was just the variety of textures on display. The shells and chimes and rain sticks, the woodwinds and synths, the strings, pianos, extremely subtle and formless drumming. Any given moment of this album feels really full-sounding and well-layered, and that was something I could pretty easily latch onto immediately. It really starts to show through in a bunch of moments later on in the album. I think my favorite cut here was track 6, Gandhi, Dalai Lama, Your Lord and Savior, JC / Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy. That's definitely the track here that felt like it had the most moving parts to it, where I felt like I was continually discovering new sounds as they all floated in and out, and the darker atmosphere it all added up to was particularly intriguing. And this mix also worked really well on a much more peaceful New Age-centric track like Ants to You, Gods to Who, hitting a lot of those old New Age cliches in the textures that I've always messed with. A weakness with this album might come through in the fact that, in the process of just following the way the wind blows, as it were, these pieces don't always tend to have that much in the way of progression and have a tendency to just meander on. Which sometimes works, especially when there's a strong tune to back everything up, like on the opener, I swear I really wanted to make a rap album, but this is literally the way the wind blew me this time. Easily the strongest of the lead melodies here and the best way for an album like this to open up. There's also a lot of solid melodic instincts behind the second track. The slang word pussy rolls off the tongue with far better ease than the proper word vagina, do you agree? And even as the album rolls on and we get tracks that have a darker tone, like That Night in Hawaii when I turned into a panther and started making these low-register purring tones that I couldn't control, shit was wild, that's where André starts playing actual flute to give that track a much more organic texture, and those above-mentioned panther noises he makes kind of remind me of the weird vocalizations that Pharoah Sanders made on the Promises album with Floating Points. There's not a lot to that track, but it is once again made compelling through that mysterious atmosphere it all creates. But as many parts of this album are genuinely compelling, there are also plenty of moments where nothing of interest really happens, kind of just rehashing ideas from elsewhere without adding something of substance. I did find the closer, Dreams Once Buried Beneath the Dungeon Floor Slowly Sprout into Undying Gardens, to be particularly long-winded and barren, made for a bit of an anticlimax finish. This album runs on for an hour and a half, and while I've definitely heard ambient projects that are way longer and more difficult to digest than this, there is the sense that it didn't absolutely need to run on as long as it did. Like, there was a loose arc to it that was made weaker by those more languid, fillery moments. Even if I do feel like the unkemptness of the album and near complete lack of structure was probably the whole point, and once again fed into the thematic exploration he was going for, I still wouldn't mind cutting this down to get something tighter and better paced. But at the end of the day, even if I wouldn't say this album is anything earth-shattering, there is clearly a lot of passion put into it, and all the feel-good vibes that André is trying to put out do feel really genuine the whole way through, and made this hit fairly immediately for me. And if he chooses to continue down this path and further develop these ideas into something more refined, there could be potential for something truly special here. Not much else to say. It's a good album. Stream Andreas Vollenweider. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. And that's it. That's the roundup. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.